Across the globe, tens of millions of people now finally see an end to the Second World War. As they celebrate, mourn, and rebuild their lives, another enemy has not surrendered. The time of war and conquest may be over, but the time of famine and death continues. I'm Spartacus Olsson. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. Throughout history, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Selos, conquest, Martius, war, Limos, famine, and Thanatos, death, have always traveled together. So far in this war, we've covered the famines in Allied-occupied Iran, in Bengal in British India, and German-occupied Greece. We saw the German effort to deliberately starve large parts of Poland and Eastern Europe under the Hunger Plan and the Holocaust. There was famine in besieged Leningrad, famine in Jewish ghettos across Europe, and starvation throughout Poland and the Soviet Union. In Asia, the Japanese invasion of China, combined with the nationalist government's destruction of the Yellow River Dam, led to famine in Henan. In Indonesia, Japan's occupation policies led to famine in Java. Already, millions of lives have been lost. Now, with the end of the war, millions more will die, and the pain of hunger will drive at least one nation to revolution. To discuss this post-war hunger at the full length it deserves would require several hours of coverage. I will endeavor to do it justice in the time I have. We start in the Netherlands with the Dutch famine, the Hunger Winter. That famine began towards September 1944. By that point, some of the southern part of the Netherlands has been liberated, but much of the country remains under German occupation, including the major cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague. Food stockpiles are already running low, especially as the Germans have requisitioned farmland for military purposes or flooded it as defense against the Allied advance. Soon, a new challenge emerges. On September 17th, the Allies launch Operation Market Garden, an airborne operation aiming to create an Allied invasion route into northern Germany and secure a speedy liberation of the rest of the Netherlands. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower requests that the Dutch government in exile order a nationwide railway strike. It is this strike and the German response to it that sows the seeds of the famine. 60% of perishable food products and a similar proportion of coal relies on rail transport. This is particularly important when it comes to transferring food supplies from the agricultural northeast to the big cities in the west. The harsh German response only makes things worse. On September 27th, Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart orders an embargo on all inland shipping and the demolition of the ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Seyss-Inquart calls off the blockade on November 8th because the Wehrmacht fear that food and fuel shortages will lead to civil unrest in the cities behind the front. But the damage has already been done. The German civil administration and the Dutch food authorities try to restart the rationing program, but the population simply do not trust either entity anymore. Many farmers and food transporters have already decided not to participate. By November, about 40% of produce is available only on the black market. Supplies of butter, vegetable fats, cheese, and bread begin to dwindle and disappear, and by the end of November, conditions in the Netherlands have reached famine levels. Official rations drop to an average of just 750 calories for adults, with manual laborers entitled to a higher allowance. Inland transport of food and fuel does resume, but these are almost immediately halted again as the canals freeze over during the bitterly cold winter of 44-45. Over that winter, the cities of Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam suffer the most, while the agricultural areas in the northeast are better able to sustain themselves. City dwellers supplement their diets with tulip bulbs, nettles, sugar beets, and grass. They smash furniture and demolish buildings for firewood. They take arduous treks into the countryside to trade jewelry, watches, clothes for food that the farmers have been holding back. The centralization of the rationing system and the setting up of soup kitchens provides some relief to the suffering. Soon at least 1 million people are reliant on them. Flour from the Swedish Red Cross begins arriving in February. In April and early May, Allied aircraft dropped food aid after reaching an agreement to safe passage with the Germans. Although they are important symbolically, the Swedish flour and the airdrop don't really relieve the famine. It is only the liberation of the Netherlands that brings true relief. By the time the Germans surrender on May 4th, 280,000 people are classified as undernourished. All in all, some 20,000 deaths will be attributed to starvation, with those over 55 years of age making up 80% of the casualties. Thanks to the Dutch health system, an epidemic of infectious disease is avoided. Immediately after the surrender, an army of Allied lorries distributes stockpiles of food aid across the country. Allied doctors arrive to assess the sick and the starving. The Red Cross collects money, food, clothes, shoes, and furniture from the unscathed south of the country. At the end of May, SHAEF hands over responsibilities to the returning Dutch government, and by July, food supplies are stabilized. Average consumption is back up to 2,600 calories, making the Dutch, once again, some of the best-fed people in Europe. As Allied civilians finally find relief from hunger, it is their Axis counterparts who face the prospect of starvation. It is only after their capitulation in May 1945 the Germans feel real hunger. Even towards the end of the war, average calorific intake stood at about 2,000 calories per day. But now, with supplies from the east long cut off, the release of the army of foreign workers and slave laborers, and the influx of ethnic German refugees from Poland and Czechoslovakia, a crisis begins to bite. SHAEF initially aims to provide an average of 2,000 calories per day to each German in the Western occupation zones, with higher allowances for manual workers and, of course, lower totals for children. However, the Western Allies have severely underestimated the extent of war damage to Germany's agricultural sector. The Allies have also underestimated how many of the Nazis' victims they have responsibility to care for. The Jewish survivors of the camps, the legions of POW, and millions of foreign workers and forced laborers. When local supplies, including the contents of Wehrmacht depots and supply dumps, are exhausted faster than expected, SHAEF drops its allowances. Soon, the official ration in the American zone provides an average of just 1,100 to 1,200 calories per day, rising to 1,500 by January of 1946. The victims of the Germans are entitled to more generous rations of between 1,600 and 2,300 calories per day, some of which is provided by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. But ordinary Germans have no recourse to these extra sources of food. Many are forced to spend hours queuing for food, pay highly inflated prices on the black market, or travel to rural areas to barter with farmers. American cigarettes become an important currency in this new economy. Moreover, averages are only that. While some get more, many get their hands on far less food. Often they are the most vulnerable in society. Things are even worse in the British zone. Northwest Germany was already reliant on food imports from other parts of the country, as well as increased mortality from starvation. Disease is a particular problem in the British zone of Berlin. During an outbreak of dysentery in July 1945, there are 66 infant deaths for every 100 live births. In October, reports home by American observers speak of 10 people dying per day of exhaustion at the Lehrter Bahnhof, the station that will become Berlin Hauptbahnhof many years later. In December, there are thousands of cases of typhoid and diphtheria, and the death rate of children under 4 years old runs at 25%. By March 1946, rations in the British zone are down to just over 1,000 calories. The Americans know that it is their responsibility to feed the German people, but many are relatively ambivalent to the prospect of hunger. As commandant of the American sector in Berlin, Frank Howley will later state, "Perhaps I've been unnecessarily blunt in saying so, but I had come to Berlin with the idea that the Germans were our enemies, even though it was becoming more evident every day that it was the Russians who really were our enemies. I was still not prepared to embrace the Germans as allies. In terms of food supply, things are somewhat better off in the Soviet zone. The Soviet authorities have more experience controlling food production and supply. They set typically high and unrealistic quotas for farmers, but this at least means that when the farmers fall short, they have still produced more than their counterparts in the British or American zones. The Soviets also deal out harsh punishments up to and including the death penalty for farmers who underreport their produce. As such, average rations stand at 1,300 calories in the Soviet sector of Berlin. But like in the British zone, big cities like Berlin and Dresden are allocated greater allowances. As such, while Dresden will avoid starvation, towns in the surrounding areas will suffer badly. In Chemnitz, reports of malnourishment begin emerging in August 1945, with children being admitted to hospital at double the previous rate. According to Soviet estimates, 600 people are dying every month throughout the summer of malnourishment. But overall, the situation is still marginally better than in the American and British zones. The deputy military governor of the American occupation zone, General Lucius Clay, will sound the alarm in March 1946. There is no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. It is my sincere belief that our proposed ration allowance in Germany will not only defeat our objectives in Middle Europe, but will pave the road to a communist Germany. The situation in occupied Germany will reach a climax a couple of years from now, the result of a poor harvest in 46 and a bitterly cold winter followed by floods and droughts in the spring and summer of 1947. Fearing that hunger may drive Germans to communism, the United States will inject massive amounts of money, industrial equipment, and food aid into Germany via the Marshall Plan in 1948. Only then will the Western Allied zone of Germany rebuild themselves into a thriving European country with strong and rapidly growing economy. But that is a story for another day. We shall put this into some perspective, though. Despite everything, Germans are still better off compared with their former enemies. The Soviet famine will not take place until mid-1946 and into 1947, but it's worth looking at because it is a product of the Second World War. In part, the coming crisis is down to the massive destruction of agricultural and infrastructure during the German occupation and of the battle for liberation, the deaths of so many millions of Soviet citizens, and a drought in 1946. But it will also be down to the policies of the Soviet government, including diverting food from domestic consumption to feeding its new satellite states in Central Europe and refusing international help for fear of appearing weak. While German women protest on the streets of Berlin in 1947, the death count in the Soviet famine will be climbing to an estimated toll of between several 100,000 and 2 million. On the other side of the world, in Asia, here too, millions of people face the prospect of famine as the war comes to an end. In Japan, food shortages are already a problem by early 1945 as the Allied blockade severs the flow of food from the empire. The staple food of white rice is replaced by barley, potatoes, and soybeans. There is an increase in vitamin deficiencies and tuberculosis. Babies are born lighter, and the growth of children is stunted. In the dying weeks of the war, the government urges its population to fight on, fueled by acorns, flower blossoms, mice, rats, snails, and insects. After the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, only a bumper harvest will avert disaster. But adverse weather, insufficient tools, a massive drop in fertilizer production, and an understandable manpower shortage will lead to a 40% drop compared to the usual yield. In the months after surrender, several thousand people die of starvation. It is the former enemy and new occupying power that will step into the breach. From 1945 to April 1952, the Americans will spend $2 billion in aid and shipment of wheat, flour, corn, legumes, sugar, powdered milk, and tinned meat being flowed into ruins of Japanese cities. Thanks to this aid, Japan avoids mass starvation. But for several years, millions of people will teeter on the brink. In part, this is down to the corruption and inefficiency of the Japanese bureaucracy, which means that rations are often below their stated allocation and are delivered weeks late. On top of that, the farmers see an opportunity for enormous profiteering, selling their goods on the black market for 15 times what they receive from selling to the state. In 1946, the average Japanese household will spend 70% of its income on food. Along with the hunger comes disease, alcoholism, an enormous rise in crime, and a general anxiety, depression, and malaise. It will be several years before life returns to something resembling normality for most Japanese people. For all the hardship that the Japanese people endure, once again, it is the victims of the Axis powers who suffer the most as famine reshapes Vietnam forever. Vietnam's two principal cities are Hanoi, sitting in the north within the Red River Delta, and Saigon in the south near the Mekong Delta in Cochin, China. Thanks to French engineering, both areas are amongst the most productive rice-producing regions in the world. But while Saigon produces large surpluses, the Red River Delta region only produces just enough rice to feed what has become an enormous population spread across the surrounding areas in Tonkin and North Annam. The trouble begins with poor harvests in 1943 and with abnormal weather in 1944. Then the coastal provinces of Tonkin and North Annam are hit by typhoons and tidal waves. Between August and October 1944, rainfall is 50% above normal levels. The Red River breaches its dikes and floods 230,000 hectares of rice. In the 8 coastal provinces of Haiduong, Quien Han, Nam Dinh, Ninh Binh, Thái Binh, Thanh Hoa, Ninh Ha, and Ha Tinh, this results in a drop in rice output to 25%. This sounds big, and it is, but this food shortage is highly localized. Outside of these provinces, rice output stays much the same and in some cases actually rises. While food is short in the north, there are huge stocks of rice built up over the last couple of years in Saigon. But the French administration running Vietnam under Japanese occupation have prohibited internal trade. Even if the French would permit the transfer of rice, American bombing has crippled Vietnam's transport network. Hundreds of thousands of refugees clog the roads throughout the winter of 44-45, heading for the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. Many of these new arrivals die quickly at the peak, between 100 and 200 people per day. One Hanoi resident will later recall that every morning he would gingerly push the door ajar to check if there was someone dead outside. By March 1945, civil unrest is brewing as starving peasants pillage French rice storage depots. In the chaos, there is opportunity for those fighting for Vietnamese independence. The suffering under the famine strengthens the cause of Ho Chi Minh and his League for the Independence of Vietnam, who since December 1944 have been launching raids on the French. Then, on March 9th, the Japanese overthrow the French administration and install Bao Dai as head of the puppet empire of Vietnam. Fearing a French uprising, the Japanese too failed to provide any effective famine relief. As support for the Viet Minh only grows further, Ho's forces organize raids at rice storages and paddies, raising the flag of Vietnamese independence after successful missions. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese surrender opens the door for the Viet Minh. Ho launches his revolution and People's Revolutionary Committees take over in the countryside while the Japanese largely stand back. On August 19th, just 900 men of the Viet Minh take control of the capital Hanoi, followed by much of the north. Emperor Bao Dai resigns, and on September 2nd, Ho declares independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Ho's regime will gain legitimacy by dealing with the famine, which racks up a final death toll of at least 1 million people, perhaps as many as 2 million. Vietnam's suffering is far from over, though. Much of the country remains outside of Ho's control, and for their part, the French are determined to take back control of their colony. The events in Vietnam are a reminder that while the Second World War may be all but over in August 1945, the fighting and suffering is not. For when mankind has sounded their horns and broken the seals that held back the horsemen of the apocalypse, together with the three horsemen Zelos, Martius, and Limos, rides the fourth, Thanatos. And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the world, to kill with sword, with hunger, and with death. When those who could help turn their back while the guns are going silent, the stillness becomes a vacuum to be filled with the noxious gases of those preaching radical solutions. In that fetid air, the galloping hooves of the horsemen will still continue to echo, and the war against humanity will be far from over. Never forget.